Public Policy and Governance Unit, we've launched this speaker series with the aim of bringing together practitioners and researchers doing focused work on issues related to democratization and rule of law. We launched our first keynote speaker with Professor Louisel, who set the scene at the, let's say, international dimension of the democratization processes. Then we had our guest speaker, Yosa Osmani, who had an overview of constitutional design and power sharing arrangements with the case study of Kosovo. And let's say that we are slowly going into the very beating heart of what we are calling the rule of law. And today we're hosting Sandra Joireman's presentation, focused on property rights and law enforcement in Kosovo. Sandra is a professor of politics at Wheaton College, Illinois. She graduated, she got her PhD from University of California, Los Angeles. Her, let's say, research interests are focused on issues of comparative political economy. She's been doing extensive work and published many books related to issues of property rights, particularly her latest book in 2011 related to property rights in Africa and law enforcement in the legal system of Africa. And today she will, under her, let's say, activity as a Fulbright scholar, she's been doing research on Kosovo and inquiring on the process of property restitution and property rights in Kosovo. So today she will give us her insights on this case. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be presenting here. I've been in Kosovo for about 4 months doing research on property rights. It's always both a pleasure and a challenge to present when you're sort of in the middle of a project. And I feel like I'm still in the middle of the questions that I'm asking, and this is my first attempt to sort of bring some things together and present them. So I will be deeply appreciative of your comments and questions at the end. And I'm also going to be specific as to which parts of my research I'm presenting here and which I am still working on. What I'm going to do is talk briefly about why property rights are important for the students who are here. For a lot of others, you know that they're important, but I'll dwell on that just briefly, and then spend most of my presentation discussing the challenges that Kosovo faces, and then come to some conclusions. So I want to begin by just talking about what property rights are. Property rights are essentially the rules of the game, the rules that govern our access to resources. You've probably heard about them with regard to intellectual property rights, because they're often fought over. You know, who has the right to the logo of Coke or Starbucks or whatever it might be. In this particular case, I'm going to be focusing on tangible assets, immovable property, homes, businesses, agricultural land. And in this regard, the rules that I'm concerned about is ownership, rental contracts, control over fields and land, sometimes also inheritance rights. And I want to talk about briefly, about why these things are so important and why it might be worthy to study property rights issues. And there are really 3 main reasons: economic development, poverty alleviation, and political stability. And I'll speak briefly to each of these. In terms of economic development, we've long known, I say we, social scientists have long been aware of the fact that when people have a very clear idea about the ownership of their resources, they are more likely to invest in them. If they know they own a field, they are more likely to improve that field through bunding or irrigation or fertilization. And the ultimate outcome of that investment is greater productivity. So ideally, in economies as a whole, and certainly in developing economies, we want secure property rights that are leading people to invest in their resources, that are leading to more greater economic output, greater production. So these are some of the sources. This is an example that I took. This is a house from Kosovo. I like this. This is typical of things that you see in this area. And I look at this house and I think these are people who believe they have secure property rights, because they have They're living in one part of the house, or maybe they're renting out pieces of it, and they're investing. What you see here is clear evidence of investment. They're building on the second part of the house, and eventually they'll use that perhaps for income generation or family property, to share with family who might want to reside with them. But this is a nice example of some people who obviously feel like they have secure property rights, and so they're investing. And just in terms of the economic benefits of this, they have to buy the brick, they have to buy all the supplies. If they're renting this property, then they're engaging the economy in those ways. All of those things are productive. The second category that I talked about was poverty alleviation. The issue of property rights and poverty alleviation is slightly more contested. This comes from the work of Hernando de Soto, who famously wrote a book in 2000 called The Mystery of Capital. And in The Mystery of Capital, de Soto argued that poor people, very poor people, own things. They are simply unable to prove that they own them. And if they were able to prove that they owned them, they would be able to sort of get documentation, mortgage their property, use those mortgages to start businesses, to get an education, to invest in their lives in some sort of way. Now this is contested, and you can ask me about that at the break. I don't have time to sort of go into all the reasons why people dislike Hernando de Soto and these ideas, but it is out there that secure property rights lead to poverty alleviation. And he's talking about places like Kibera settlement in Nairobi. I did some work in Kibera, and all of the people who are living in these shacks actually are renting them out from landlords, and they have contracts. And it's hard to believe that that would be the case in an area like this, but somebody owns this land. Somebody owns those shacks, and they're renting it out. Now, the government's not willing to go in and enforce those rental contracts, and that has led to actually quite a few negative consequences. And I'll note a few because they come up later in the presentation. In Kibera, the government won't enforce rental contracts. So somebody makes a deal with their landlord. They're paying 600 Kenyan shillings a month for rent. The landlord finds somebody who will pay more, goes and evicts that person or tries to evict them. A slum dweller going to the government can't get the government to take any action on this. The government says, it's your problem, not ours. And so what do? They go to gangs in the area and they say, hey look, I got a problem with my landlord. What do I need to pay you to go threaten my landlord so that I can keep my apartment? And there's a regular involvement of gangs in Kenya, or particularly in Kibera, in the enforcement of contracts in poor areas. So it's a very negative consequence of the government's lack of enforcement. Which brings me to my third point. I talked about this as political stability, prevention of violence, quality of life. I mean, all of these things sort of get to the basic issue here that when the government doesn't enforce property rights, people often turn to private actors to do so. Now, my recent book that Lorena was talking about discussed the evidence of this happening in Ghana, in Kenya, and in Uganda. Frederick Varese finds the same things in Russia, where the government doesn't enforce property rights, so the mafia steps in, and the mafia starts to enforce people's property rights. And the absence of government enforcement of property rights sort of creates a political space where you can get these actors, what political scientists like to call, I love this euphemism, specialists in violence, right? It's so sanitized, right? But that's what we call them. Specialists in violence will help you get your property rights enforced. Now, the very interesting thing about this is that, 10 years ago, if you asked an economist or a political scientist how to, in a state that's not functioning, where there's a state that's not functioning, who gets their property rights enforced, they would tell you, wealthy people do, poor people don't. Well, what we're increasingly finding is that poor people can't get their property rights enforced, but the way that they go about it is extra legal, tends to involve violence, tends to have a lot of negative externalities for the society. So Here's some nice pictures. This is in Kibera. This is that's the same area where I was working, same picture I showed you before, and this was at the elections when the gangs that were so busy enforcing the property contracts of the poor decided that they didn't like the electoral outcome of the last election, and so rioted, and a lot of people died in the election violence in Nairobi 2007-2008. The Russian mafia, and then this is my favorite, this little guy who's got, up at the top there, who's got his injured leg. I want to talk a little bit about the Ghanaian case because I think it actually is closest to the Kosovo case. In Ghana, Ghana is a country that has been developing very, very rapidly. They have had growth rates of 8 to 10% a year for 10 years. As a result of that, land values have been increasing in the capital city. There's a lot of buying and selling of land. But the government has not enforced people's property rights. And so what happens? Your land value is high. It's very high. The government is not going to come and protect your land. What happens is if you start to build, somebody else might come in and take over your plot of land and say, this was really mine, and then what are you going to do? Well, you can take them to court, and the average court case over land in Ghana, 15 years, 16 years. So a lot of people don't want to go that route. So what they do is they hire people called land guards, specialists in violence, okay, who will police their land for them. And we've seen a proliferation of these folks in the Ghanaian context. And they are often involved in violence, as we see here, this man who was injured by one. They have also led to all kinds of negative externalities in the Ghanaian case, like the proliferation of a small arms market in Accra, and just a general lawlessness. So when we talk about this property rights not being enforced, not only are you not getting economic development, and not potentially getting poverty alleviation, but you're also opening the door for other people who might be engaged in enforcement activities. Ideally, what we want is we want our law to align with practice, the law to be enforced, to give us secure property rights, and secure property rights are going to give us economic growth, political stability, poverty alleviation. So goes the theory, at least. Okay, this is the way things are supposed to work. And where we need to be concerned is when law and practice are going in opposite directions. Then we should be very concerned. Now, sometimes law and practice go in opposite directions and it doesn't matter, right? This is true. Sometimes we have laws that are not enforced and there's really no serious outcome to this. I can think immediately of a couple things in the United States. You know, we've got laws in most states against online gambling, right? And yet there's all kinds of online gambling that goes on in the United States where people are gambling through the internet. And it's not really enforced. It's not enforced because law enforcement officials have limited resources. They say, well, the people who are suffering from that are the people who are doing that, and so they just kind of let it go. But when we talk about property rights, the rules that are governing immovable assets like land and houses and businesses, it's very important that law and practice align, and so we don't want to see this divergence going in two different directions. So that brings me to Kosovo and the Kosovo case, and I want to talk about the challenges that Kosovo faces. While I've been here, on my Fulbright grant, I've been looking at 3 different areas of gap between law and law enforcement in Kosovo, because this is my area of specialization. I look at what's going on when laws aren't enforced. And I've been working on post-conflict property restitution issues, property inheritance rights of women, and then also property registration and construction. In each of these areas, we see some sort of non-alignment of law and practice. The reasons are different, right? In the case of post-conflict property restitution, what we see is that policy and international law is not necessarily aligning well with people's desires and intents, okay? Property and inheritance rights of women, we've got cultural issues at play. And it's this third area that I want to hone in on, property registration and construction. And I want to talk about this area in particular because I think that this year and the coming years in Kosovo, these issues are of critical importance. So again, to remind you, what are we looking for? We want the law and the practice to be sort of working together to give us secure property rights. That's what we want to see. And the first problem that we see in the Kosovo case has to do with the cadaster. And I'm not assuming that anybody here knows what a cadaster is. If you do, that's great. Some of you might. But this is a picture of a cadaster. A cadaster is essentially the record of property holdings in any state or municipality in the area. And a cadaster is made up of two things: graphical data. So in this case, you see aerial photos and boundaries that are marked out in green. And it also captures textual data, the name of the owner and the occupant, the title number, the registration block and the plot number. Increasingly, technology, GIS technology, is allowing us to sort of actually pull up contracts, sale contracts, attached to a particular plot of land. Now this cadaster is from, I think it's actually from like Montana, somewhere in the United States. But I'm going to show you another one in just a second. But you see here, these green lines are blocking out the property, and those green lines are sort of generated by the computer based on surveyors' documentation. We have a number assigned to every dwelling, and that number is going to tell us, is that a multifamily dwelling, single-family dwelling, is it a business, what is it? And then we also have block numbers and plot numbers. So every state should have a cadaster like this because it's giving you the image as well as the textual data. You could then sort of double-click in the new technology. There were other ways of doing this before. But you can double-click on one of these numbers, and you can be looking at who holds title, what kind of dwelling is it, when was it bought and sold. All of that data is right at your fingertips. That's a cadaster. Now, Kosovo has been building a cadaster. In fact, this is a picture. I took this off the Kosovo Cadastral Agency website. It's not the best photo. But you can see that they have the aerial photo, they have the outlines of the buildings, they have the plot numbers. It's all there. So these are all plot numbers. I don't know if you can see this in the back. But Kosovo has been working very diligently using state-of-the-art technology at reconstructing their cadaster. So that kind of thing is available in Kosovo. But the problem is, what are they reconstructing, right? Because there's this problem with property records in Kosovo, and the problem dates back to 1999 and to the war. In the war, or at the time of the war, the Serbs removed the cadastral records. So they took them away in everywhere but Rahovic, and you can ask me about that in a second. But Rahovic, they have complete cadastral records. But they took them away in 1999 and left the country with nothing, and what happened was Kosovo immediately began to reconstruct the cadaster, to try and put things back together, try and gather documents. Now, some people had documents, others don't. If you own a house, how many of you actually have a copy of your plat of survey and title deed at home? Some of you do, some of you have it in a safety deposit box, and some people don't, right? Some people don't. And what has happened between the records being removed in the current time is that people have been buying and selling land. People have been constructing buildings. The economy has carried on, gotten better, but there is a lot of uncertainty around what's been going on in the cadaster, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And this year is particularly important because this year the cadastral records are being returned, or copies of them are being returned by Serbia, and we have a mechanism proposed for the verification of those property records. I'll come to that and talk more about that. So the incomplete cadaster has led us to a second and perhaps more serious problem, and that in the absence of the existing records, people still bought and sold land. They did. Sometimes they did that legally, if they had the documents, if they had all the necessary information. You can buy and sell land, you can buy and sell buildings. You can just take your documents. I've got the process in just a second. I'll show it to you. You can just take your documents down to the municipal office. You can get a verification of your sale contract. You can have your sale entered into the cadaster, no problem. You could also, if you didn't have documents, you could go to Serbia and get them. and try and get a copy of the documents that you needed, maybe their ownership documents. I was talking to a man in the, who actually worked in the cadastral office in Farazai, and he was telling me, he said, you know, I've got this land that I own. I know I own it. It's my mother's, but my mother is dead. I need to get the land transferred into my name so that I can sell it. I don't have the right documents, so I'm going to wait. He said, because my other option is to go to Serbia. I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to kind of wait until the records come back, hope for the best. You know, this is somebody in the cadastral office saying this. So it's a problem that, that a lot of people have. So those are legal, you know, people trying to do things legally, but then there were also a lot of things happening illegally. If you owned property and you couldn't prove it, and you wanted to sell your land, and you did it anyway, even though you didn't have the proper documents, okay? There's also illegal sales of property that people did not own, and you've probably heard about a lot of these examples. And also sales of property based on title and not on any graphic image, right? So you've got a title document that says, yes, you own this, but there's no sort of image or graphical survey to go along with this. So you sell the land, but what exactly have you sold, right? And when we're talking about agricultural land or city boundaries, which you know, neighbors build close to one another, these boundary issues become incredibly important. An examination of the property documents that was done in 2003 by USAID showed that the property boundaries and identities of land occupants matched the legal documents in only 50% of the cases. Okay, so that's bad, but we hope things have gotten better since then. Certainly people have been working on it. You know, people have been really working quite diligently to try and get things in better shape. All right, so this is the legal process. If you wanted to legally buy or sell land, you can in Kosovo, and if you have documents, there's not a problem for you. You start at the municipal cadastre office, you present your property certificate, your lot plan, you then go get your tax confirmation letter, you get the agreement legalized by the court, you register the transfer of property in the municipal cadastre office, and those records are then uploaded to the Kosovo Cadastral Agency, and they are keeping a record of the cadastre for the whole country. The problem is it might not be entirely accurate, and that's the big fear. Now, and here we have the current issues then. This is just a handful of them. I could actually talk about a number of others, but we've got cases of unclear ownership, either two people contesting a piece of land, or inheritance that has not been completed. Parents died, left the land to children, and the documents were never transferred. Maybe some of those children went and emigrated, and who owns this? It's not clear. We also have undocumented or contested sales, illegal construction, boundary conflicts, and then people who are owning land without documentation. So these are some of the current issues with regard to documentation that exist in Kosovo. Now, I think this year is something of a watershed. And there are a number of things happening this year that I guess make me worry and also make me think what a wonderful opportunity to sort things out. One of them is that as a result of the diplomatic initiative between Serbia and Kosovo, the records are coming back. Copies of the records, the property records are coming back. And the civil registry records are already back, or copies of them, and there's a verification process currently underway to make sure that all the civil registry documents are brought back, repatriated to Kosovo, and verified. But this is going slowly. There's a bill before Parliament right now, it has not yet passed, for the Property Verification Agency. And the Property Verification Agency is essentially an organization that is established to make sure that the records that are coming back align with the cadastral records that the KCA currently has. Now, we can expect that there are going to be a lot of cases where there's not alignment. And some of that is going to be because of legal activity, where people just didn't have the right records, or what do I want to say? I don't want to say legal and illegal. I want to say sort of good intentions, bad intentions, right? In some cases, people are clearly trying to take advantage of a situation. In other cases, they're just sort of trying to get by and they didn't have the records, right? So both of these kinds of cases are going to have to be vetted by the Property Verification Agency. So that's all happening. And in addition to this, we have a new construction law that has passed. Passed last July 18th. And under the new construction law, you have to demonstrate a legal right to the property on which you're building. And if you don't demonstrate that legal right, the property can be demolished. This is a sort of much more robust construction law than Kosovo has ever had in the past. It's good law. It's a necessary law. But this law, combined with sort of the property registers coming back, makes the next couple of years an interesting time period. It's sort of out ahead of us, because there's going to be a lot of conflict over land issues, and particularly here in Pristina, where I'm sure many of you are aware of issues of illegal construction or have heard fears and rumors about what has happened to the documents in Serbia. Okay, so next steps are critical. As I noted, there's a lot of fear and uncertainty about the records. It's clear that the verification process has to be handled carefully, and it has to be very transparent and above board. And I want to talk a little bit, I'm bringing in the theory again here. Enforcement is absolutely critical. As these decisions are made by the PVA, as the construction law is implemented, enforcement of these decisions, enforcement of the law is critical. It's critical to get all these nice benefits, and it's also critical to shut out external actors, illegal actors who might become involved in protection rings and all the kinds of things that we see happening in other settings around the world where property rights are not enforced by the government. Okay, again, just to reiterate the two goals in doing all of this: economic growth, which would give us, coming from investment and perhaps poverty alleviation in the best of scenarios, and political stability through the state enforcement of property rights, excluding private actors, and encouraging compliance with law. So let me just conclude, and then I'll take questions. I've talked about the theory, and I've talked about the importance of property rights for economic growth and development, for political stability, quality of life. I've discussed the challenges that are faced in Kosovo, and I've ended by emphasizing this particularly significant time that we're in, when enforcement of property law could have all these positive benefits and leading to greater economic development, or it could open the door to further illegal activity if it is not enforced. It is not enforced. So I think I'll stop there and just take any questions. I know we have a lot of people in this room who know quite a bit about property rights, and I would welcome your questions and your comments. Lorena.
Sandra, I don't really have a question, it's just a statement. Very interesting. I enjoyed listening to your talk, and you probably are aware of this, but I lived in northern Cyprus for many years, and the problem is identical between Greek Cyprus in the south and Turkish Cyprus in the north. So if for your next Fulbright, you might want to go to Cyprus.
What's the weather like? Yes, this might be nice. Other questions or comments?
Thank you for your presentation.
I want you to talk into the microphone. I believe
Yeah,
you're recording
okay.
it.
Hi, my name is Alexander, and I've been in Kosovo for donkey's years, and very much involved in a lot of the things that you've been talking about today. Thank you for your presentations, very, very interesting and comprehensive as well. I just wanted to ask you if in your research here, you sort of came into the link between bank lending and property rights. What access do people have to funding for the most important decision in their lives is buying their own home? Can they do it here? If so, under what conditions?
Right.
If not, why not?
Okay,
Thank
so,
you.
yeah, it's a good question. The question was about bank lending and property rights. And I might note why this question is so important. This is essentially the critical link that DeSoto poses. It says, you know, if you want poverty alleviation, having a legal title to land or to homes allows you to mortgage, and mortgage is the process via which you're going to get out of poverty. That said, there's very, very little mortgaging that happens in Kosovo. Part of the reason, I kind of want to, you know, Bill Donovan, maybe you can comment on this at some point. We have somebody from the central bank here. But part of the reason that that happens is because people have no, the banks don't trust that they would actually be able to expropriate property that was given as security. And until they have confidence that they would be able to do that, there's no reason for them to lend. Now, there have been some very interesting arrangements that have come about in lieu of mortgaging in the Kosovar case. One of which I'm aware is that the banks will buy a condominium and you can then rent from the bank. So they are actually holding the security themselves, and it's not a typical mortgage arrangement. But mortgage arrangements are really, a vibrant mortgage market is dependent on clear and secure property rights, but it's also dependent on property rights that can be expropriated, and that remains to be seen in the Kosovar context. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Luca?
Well, thanks, Sandra, for this very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I wanted to vent some skepticism about the importance of property rights for development. Well, it may be that your presentation was more focused on residential property rather than, say, property for industry and commercial property. But what I think is questionable in your argument is that you seem to give it for granted that there's some kind of consensus in political economy that property rights are necessary for development, and I think that there's no such consensus. And in fact, there may be a consensus in the neoliberal camp, say, as to the importance of property rights, but certainly there's no such consensus across the board. And I think there's two, say, myths bound up in this idea that property rights are necessary for development. One is the idea that property rights are necessary to attract investors, to encourage investment, as you put it. And the second one is that property rights are necessary for overall efficiency in the economy. And the reason, and I think that both propositions are false. And the reason why I think that property rights are not necessary to attract investors is that property rights have a value, and what investors do all the time when they go abroad and invest in unstable constituencies, in unstable jurisdictions, is that they monetize that value and they cost that value of property rights into their business plans. So when transaction costs due to property rights instability are high, those extra costs after due diligence exercises are undertaken are simply cost into the business plan.
Right, but that's why then countries like Kosovo don't get any external investment, right? Or so I think that argument actually comes back around to proving the point. I mean, you're right, I'm coming from a neoliberal perspective, so absolutely right. You know, there are some other arguments out there. But yes, once you cost it in, it becomes prohibitively expensive, and therefore there is no, people don't make investment decisions for countries where their property rights are insecure, and that's why Kosovo gets no external investment. And that we see sort of across the board on a countrywide basis, or I mean, across countries.
Well, if I may
please.
reply quickly. I agree that Kosovo gets very little external investment. I would say that there's deeper structural rather than institutional reasons why Kosovo doesn't get external investment. But the other side of the coin is that, at least in some sectors, say the mining sector, which is what I study, it would be, if we took the property rights paradigm as the explanans, we wouldn't be able to explain why unstable, coup-prone countries in Africa get a lot of mining investment. So when, I mean, clearly there's no huge risks of coup in Kosovo. So why would mining companies invest in Guinea, where there's constant threats of expropriation? So you wouldn't be able to explain it.
You know, we can talk about that, but maybe we should talk about that later, because I do think that there are resource-specific issues sometimes, and oil would be your other interesting resource, where maybe the benefits are so high that you wouldn't see an impediment to investment. Henry.
Yes, I wonder whether I wonder whether you are going to touch this topic also from point of view of future of Kosovo in terms of ethnicity, of returns, and all related issues. And maybe also, maybe it's not directly connected, but it's a problem which is inherited. It's a socially owned property, and the problem how to transform it into private or public property, and these things. Thank you.
I've been actually doing quite a bit of research on that. In fact, I was in Gračanica just yesterday talking to municipality officials about how angry they were that what was declared to be a socially owned enterprise there had previously been restored to its owners, and then after the fact, this is their story, right, was declared to be a socially owned enterprise, and now it's subject to privatization. And they, their point of view was, this is happening because we're Serbs. It was their story. It's their story. That's what they were telling me. Yeah, I know. This matters, right? The issue of restitution of property matters. Now, it's complicated. It's complicated by the fact that not everybody is so keen to return and to reclaim property. And even the people who come back and return to reclaim their property then decide they don't want to live here. And they leave again. Now, there has been, I think, well, let me say first of all, I'm not going to give you any conclusive statements on this at the moment, because I'm not, sort of to the point where I feel like I've totally got it sorted out. But I think that there is a certain degree of thoughtful, active engagement by the Kosovar government to try and provide an ability for groups to return. And where that engagement is coming from, some desire for recognition, is coming from pressure from the international community, but the government is working on these things and is working on them with some diligence. So, yeah.
I beg to differ on this because your presentation is the gap between practice and law, and I think that this is the core of the whole problem. And if you say that the government is doing the effort, I saw today the statement of Minister for Returns. He was not satisfied. And for example, now we see developments about visa liberalization. On one hand, there is strong statement Kosovo fulfilled everything. On the other hand, there is European Commission position and opposition position saying basically most of the work is ahead. And this return problem and ethnic composition, my view on this is that, well, maybe in 20, 30 years the property rights will be settled, but then by then there will be almost no Serbs here. That is a very strong tendency. And my question is about this property verification agency. Where is the point where the property claims should be verified, whether it's 1999 or whether it's any other date?
Right.
This is, I think, very, very important. Yeah. I know many people who have, let's say, Serb people who live in, let's say, in Račanica, who have property in Pristina, but they cannot get it at all. It's a question about what you mentioned, that Serbia took to the cadastral records. I wonder why they didn't cooperate on this, for example, with UNMIC. I think it was a big mistake from their side. And yes, so this is my let's say there are, let's say, so-called small cases, but which are very important for returns. But the case of Dechani, I think, is really illustrative how this doesn't work.
Right.
That there are legal decisions which are not respected, and for the monastery in Dechani, this is absolutely crucial question of survival. So, and Father Sava, he is very, pro. He tends to make compromises. But if you alienate people like this, I mean, Kosovo government, then we have big problems.
Right. Well, you're raising a number of issues. One of them is if the property verification agency, what will the eventual legislation say, and where will they start the comparison of records? If you talk to the folks in Gračanica, they want you to start looking at what's happening between 89 and 99, not just take the records at 99. There are lots of reasons for that, because they feel like some things were restored to them that were socially owned and they want to claim them. I have no doubt what you're saying, that the issue of recognizing the property rights of people who were displaced is critical. I agree with that. What I am not certain of at this point is that there are people who are really being prevented from returning because of their property rights issues. And I think that in that regard, 2013 looks a lot different than 2003. And it's also the case that, we have a comment, and we could talk more about this. So, but this is a very big issue, because if we're talking about rule of law, and we're talking about trying to make the society's laws align with enforcement so that we get these benefits, we need to see, A, the enforcement of decisions, such as in the Dechani case, and also the restoration of people's property rights. I don't contest this. Alexander, you had a comment.
Yes. If I may, just to say, you raised the issue of restitution. I think the question of returns is a completely different matter. Restitution of property is one of the most complex legal matters on earth. And in Kosovo, it's even more complex.
Right.
And that's why during the negotiations, the outside negotiations, it was not possible to go beyond a firm commitment to introduce proper restitution laws that would allow then the matters to be regulated with the help of the courts. So let us not single out one single restitution, say that is valid and that should be implemented, because that's the case of the Dechani property. Okay, and I think that is a matter that should have been left to the court without executive interference. Unfortunately, there was a lot of executive interference, which tended to push it towards the Dechani property being given back because of a restitution that was made years ago. Hundreds of restitutions were made. Most of them have not been respected or recognized. So I think I just want to say that there should be some caution. These are matters, property rights, that should be decided in the courts based on clear laws, and if the laws are not clear, you cannot have clear judicial decisions. So Kosovo is one of the most complex areas for residential property rights.
Right.
We have made huge advances. We're not perfect, but we've made many good steps.
Right, but with regard to your comment, there are, the Pinero principles do lay out there's an agreement, it doesn't really hit the status of international law, but an agreement that was made that restoring people's property would be the best thing, because it allows them to return. As a secondary option, you might want to do restitution. And the reason that they say restoring people's property would be the first best solution is because restoring property actually prevents sort of just a verification or an acceptance of ethnic cleansing. If you're just restituting people's property, oh, you were displaced, okay, we'll give you some money for that. That's viewed under the international legal principles as being definitely a second best solution. Michael?
I have a question, because I'm not sure how far back your research is going yet. Privatization started happening here after the breakup of the communist state. And then so different people were given different pieces of property, and then since '99, again, different governments have given different people different pieces of property. Have you looked at how that's going to play out, and how is that? Because as you said, this is incredibly complicated, especially with some of the municipal things. One government said this is privatized, and then another government might say, well, no, actually, it's still.
Well,
how does this get sorted out?
You put your finger on one of the big problems is when do you start the restitution process, and that's really I don't have right at the top of my head the exact answer, but I know that for KPA.
If you did, I'm sure you got a really good job for you.
But for KPA, it was very specific. They said we're only going to look at these sort of this set of properties, and that the sort of discussing one set and not another is one of the issues that has led to some anger in certain quarters. So you're right to say that there are a lot of different things going on because we have a conflict that was going on in the middle of a post-communist transition. Okay, maybe we should take one
We
minute?
have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay.
Sandra, you're specialists in violence. You don't have to name any name. Is there a presence of that in Kosovo, as far as you know,
Yes.
or is the current the government trying to stop it happening?
Yes, there is a presence of that I'm aware of. I have not been documenting that or researching that. I'm aware it's going on. And I sort of raise these issues because I think I know without even doing serious research into what's happening, I know that there's all sorts of illegal construction. I know that the people who are engaging in that illegal construction feel like they are getting, they're going to be allowed to keep that. So how is that the case that they feel like it? Well, either they feel like they have strong enough ties to the government, or something else is going on. So this illegal construction has already opened the door to the activity of other groups, specialists in violence, but in terms of naming names and pointing out a cartel to you, I am not going to do that.
Oh, good, because I don't really want to know. I was just thinking that perhaps at some point these, and I don't know, maybe it's happening in certain countries in Africa, the specialists in violence at some point become a parallel economy.
Yes, they do. That's exactly right. And in fact, I can speak to the Kenyan case. The same group that was busy enforcing the rental contracts in Kibera, they referred to themselves as the Kamkunji, or also as the Taliban, because they thought it would sound, scarier. And they were a Luo gang, and they ran the whole slum of Kibera. And they also, they are just one of a number of gangs in Kenya that operate in this sort of illegal way but are tolerated. There's another one called the Mungiki in Kenya that run the whole transport system. Like all the
then they get
taxis,
into
the buses.
social programs and welfare programs.
Well, what's very interesting, Lorena, is I was able to interview some of the Kamkunji in Kibera, and they talked about themselves as providing a public service. They used this very interesting language. They said, who's going to take care of these people if we don't take care of them? The government's not doing it. We provide a public service. And they would also they just used this language that was very, I don't know, like these people had been to UN trainings, that they were gang members.
And we had that in New York, with the Guardian Angels.
Right.
The New York
But so you do see them getting involved in lots of economic activities, but typically it comes about with the government. I mean, when there's an opening between law and the government not enforcing law in an area where there are high-value assets.
Yeah, but you can see this go even further, and I'm thinking about Palestine and Israel. Very similar issues.
Yeah.
Very, very similar. And now in certain areas in the Middle East, you now have legitimate governments that emerged out of situations like this. very interesting.
I had 2 points. One is this idea that there are alternative kind of systems of government that are going to go into place.
Yeah.
If absent a regular government, I think that just proves your thesis about property rights. I mean, if the government doesn't provide property rights, gangs seem to automatically form to provide them. So it seems that there's a value to property rights. I mean, it seems like that's more evidence than you would possibly need to demonstrate that you have to have, either legally or illegally, some sort of property rights. And I think that Luca's exception is when there's resource extraction going on.
Yeah.
If the bet is I can extract resources fast enough
Right.
and profitably enough, that if the government comes in and takes what I do, that I can still win that. I think that's a calculation that could be made.
Business
Yeah, it's a business. Yeah, exactly. It's a business risk, and I think you could calculate well how likely and how soon is the government likely to transition into something that will be opposite to me, and if I can get out enough money in resources fast enough, then I don't have to worry about that rule of law problem.
Right. This is why there's no governance in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, because a lot of people are involved there extracting resources. They sort of are making the calculation that the government is not going to come in and enforcing their right.
Right.
And
Can we steal it fast enough and get out of here
before anything happens?
Okay, so just let me wrap it up for a second and say that we raised many important issues here, and I'd like to thank Sandra and you also for your comments and for, let's say, giving us this opportunity to reflect on what the rule of law actually is. I mean, it appears as a new nostrum. It appears in daily rhetoric, in political rhetoric. People are talking about the rule of law, but yes, I mean, we do need these moments to reflect on what rule of law is and how it really applies in contexts like Kosovo, or as it appeared, let's say, property rights are at the core of let's say, this rule of law promotion process. We raised a couple of interesting issues pertaining to political stability, to transitional justice also. Yeah, I'd like to thank Sandra and you also for your